The forest breathed. It was not a breath like a living creature's, but a subtle, pervasive pulse that rippled through the air, the trees, and the very ground beneath Eleanor Nell Hayes's feet. As she stepped cautiously beneath the towering pines, the dense canopy blocked out much of the fading afternoon light, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted like living things. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine resin, but beneath that, something fouler crawled at the edges of her senses, a metallic temps that made her stomach churn. Nell's boots pressed into the soft carpet of needles and fallen leaves, and every crunch seemed amplified in the unnatural stillness. No birds sang, no insects chirped. Instead, a faint susurrus threaded through the branches, the softest of whispers, barely audible, yet undeniably present. She stopped, heart pounding, straining to catch the words tangled within the breeze. They were fractured, like half-remembered secrets carried from the mouths of unseen lips. "Do you hear it?" Marcus Flynn's voice was low and gravelly behind her, his flashlight casting a narrow beam that danced nervously along the moss-covered trunks. His usually gruff tone was edged with unease. "I do," Nell whispered, swallowing hard. "It's like the forest is speaking." Marcus shook his head, a skeptical frown creasing his weathered face. "You and your stories. It's just the wind messing with your mind." But Nell wasn't so sure. The feeling was too real, too immediate. The forest seemed to respond to their presence, shifting subtly as if watching, waiting. A sudden rustle to their left made both spin toward the sound. Nell caught a glimpse of movement, shadow darting between the trees, too quick to identify. Her breath caught. The hairs at the back of her neck prickled. She reached instinctively for the small notebook she kept tucked in her jacket, fingers trembling as she jotted down the moment. Shadow moving just beyond sight, forest alive. Deeper into the woods, the atmosphere thickened. The air grew colder, and the light dimmer, as dusk bled into night. Nell's vision began to blur at the edges, the line between what was real and what was illusion fraying like worn fabric. Shapes flickered in the periphery, twisted limbs that might have been trees or something else entirely. The ground beneath her seemed to undulate softly, as if breathing with her. A low moan echoed, not quite wind, not quite animal. Her chest tightened with a rising panic. "Marcus, do you feel it? Like the forest is alive?" He nodded grimly. "Yeah, like it's watching us." Their footsteps quickened, crunching loudly in the oppressive silence. Nell's mind raced, memories of Mabel Crane's warnings echoing in her ears. The pines remember. They know. They wait. Later, in the dim warmth of Mabel's cabin, the flickering firelight cast dancing shadows across the walls, thick with dried herbs and ancient tomes. Mabel's eyes, sharp and piercing despite her age, fixed on Nell with an intensity that made her shiver. "You've felt it, haven't you?" Mabel's voice was a hushed rasp, woven with urgency and sorrow. "The forest breathes with old fear. It feeds on what we carry inside, the doubt, the grief, the terror." Nell nodded, clutching her journal close. "How do we fight something like that?" Mabel's gaze darkened. "We don't. Not in the way you want. We survive by understanding, by respecting the balance. The primordial shade stirs, and it's hungry. But it's not just an enemy. It's a force older than us all." Outside, the night deepened. Strange, almost melodic sounds echoed, half songs, half wails carried on the wind through the skeletal branches. Nell pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block the creeping madness. The forest was alive, and it was watching. The following evening, Nell and Marcus traced a narrow, shadowed path, their flashlights weak swords against the blackness. Each step felt heavier, laden with an unseen weight. Suddenly, Marcus's beam caught a pair of glowing eyes, small, coal-like, unblinking, fixed on them from the underbrush. The eyes disappeared as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind a silence more frightening than any sound. "What was that?" Nell whispered, voice barely audible. Marcus exhaled slowly, a mixture of fear and resolve settling over him. Something not quite human. Nell swallowed her rising terror, steeling herself. The forest's breath was no longer just a whisper in the wind. It was a living presence, a dark heartbeat that pulsed with ancient power. To unravel its secrets, she would have to face the shadows within and those lurking beyond. As they pressed onward, the whispers grew louder, and the darkness deepened. Somewhere in the depths of the pine barrens, the primordial shade stirred, and Nell could feel its gaze upon her. The forest was awakening, and so was the terror it concealed. She glanced back once more, the path behind swallowed by darkness, knowing that with every step forward, the boundary between myth and nightmare grew thinner. The whispers never truly ended, they only waited for the right ears to listen. And Nell was listening now. The night had swallowed the pine barrens whole, the thick canopy blotting out the stars and moon, leaving only the impenetrable darkness of the forest. Eleanor Nell Hayes moved cautiously, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the blackness, illuminating twisted branches and bristling underbrush. Beside her, Deputy Marcus Flynn's heavy steps crunched against the leaf-strewn earth, his leather jacket rustling softly. Neither spoke, the oppressive silence between them charged with unspoken dread. They had followed the cryptic directions Mabel Crane had given them, leading to a clearing deep within the forest where the ancient bindings of the primordial shade had once held sway. Now, that power waned, and the creature they sought to understand was stirring, its presence palpable even before they saw it. As they stepped into the clearing, a sudden chill gripped the air. Nell shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The usual symphony of night sounds, the rustling of leaves. The distant hoot of an owl had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against their eardrums. Shadows danced at the edges of their flashlights' beams, flickering and twisting in unnatural ways. Marcus tightened his grip on his flashlight, eyes darting nervously. "You feel that?" he whispered. "Yeah," Nell replied, her voice barely audible. "Like the forest itself is holding its breath." The darkness ahead thickened, coalescing into a mass that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Slowly, the amorphous shape began to take form, a swirling, shifting entity of shadow and smoke, its edges flickering like dying embers. Two burning coals glowed fiercely where eyes should be, fixed on Nell and Marcus with ancient malevolence. The primordial shade had unveiled itself. Nell's heart hammered in her chest as she instinctively stepped back, but the clearings seemed to shrink around them, the darkness pressing in with a tangible weight. The shade's form rippled, revealing glimpses of twisted, grotesque creatures lurking within its smoky, depth-twisted limbs and snarling faces that vanished as quickly as they appeared. "By God," Marcus breathed, his skepticism shattered. "It's real." Nell swallowed her fear. Reaching into her pack for the talismans Mabel had entrusted to her simple charms of wood and iron, etched with symbols from old rites. She clutched them tightly, reciting the incantations Mabel had taught her, her voice trembling but steady. The shade hissed, a sound like the rustling of dead leaves and the crackling of fire, and recoiled slightly. Tendrils of shadow lashed out toward them, their edges glowing with embers that burned without flame. The air grew thick, charged with a malevolent energy that clawed at their minds, threatening to overwhelm. Marcus raised his flashlight like a weapon, the beam cutting through the darkness, forcing the shade back a step. "Keep going, Nell." Summoning every ounce of courage, Nell pressed on with the ritual, her words weaving a fragile shield against the ancient evil. The creature writhed, flickering between forms, its fury palpable. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the primordial shade began to dissipate, melting into the shadows of the forest like smoke caught in the wind. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. Nell dropped to her knees, breath ragged, sweat slicking her brow. Marcus stood nearby, eyes wide, face pale but resolute. What was that?" Marcus finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Something older than any legend we've heard," Nell replied, her gaze fixed on the darkened treetops. "And it's far from done with us." The forest around them seemed to exhale, the night sound slowly creeping back into the clearing, but the sense of dread lingered. A whisper in the wind that promised the battle for the pine barrens was only beginning. They rose together, knowing that the dark heart of the forest had been unveiled, and that whatever came next, they would face it with the fragile hope born from confronting the unimaginable. But as they turned to leave, Nell caught a flicker in the corner of her eye, an ember glowing faintly in the distance, like the lingering gaze of a nightmare that refused to fade. The primordial shade was watching, and it was waiting. The cabin was steeped in shadows, the only light coming from the crackling hearth that cast flickering shapes across the walls lined with bundles of dried herbs and ancient trinkets. Nell sat across from Mabel Crane, whose piercing eyes gleamed with a mixture of sorrow and fierce resolve. Between them lay a collection of brittle parchments, each etched with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the firelight. Mabel's voice was low, almost a whisper, as she began to unravel the secrets of the old rites. These bindings were not just spells. They were promises made to the forest itself, a pact between the settlers and the darkness that dwelled beneath these pines. The primordial shade is older than any of us, and it feeds on fear on life. To hold it, we must channel not just power, but will. Nell leaned forward, her journal forgotten beside her as the gravity of Mabel's words sank in. The ancient texts spoke of circles drawn with sacred herbs, chants in forgotten tongues, and offerings made to the unseen forces that governed the land. It was a delicate balance, and any misstep could unleash horrors beyond imagining. Together, they prepared for the ritual, gathering rare herbs and relics Mabel had preserved through decades. As night fell over the pine barrens, the two women ventured deep into the forest, the moon a sliver in the ink-black sky. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and every shadow seemed to twitch with unseen life. In a small clearing ringed by gnarled trees, Mabel began the incantations, her voice steady despite the palpable tension. Nell followed, repeating the words with trembling lips. The forest held its breath, the usual chorus of nocturnal creatures silenced as if watching. At the ritual's peak, a sudden gust snuffed out their fire, plunging them into darkness. The oppressive presence of the primordial shade pressed close, a cold that seeped into Nell's bones. Her heart hammered as the shadows seemed to writhe and coalesce around them, a shifting mass of coal-like eyes and amorphous shapes. Mabel's hand found Nell's, grounding her. "Do not falter. The forest remembers. The pact endures." Relighting the fire, they completed the rite, a faint glow emanating from the circle's center. It was fragile, a tenuous thread holding back the encroaching darkness. Back at the cabin, Nell pored over the ancient texts by candlelight, each flicker casting dancing shadows that whispered of the forest's restless secrets. The knowledge was a double-edged sword. It gave her hope, but also revealed the scale of the danger. The primordial shade was no mere legend. It was a force older than the trees, and its awakening was inevitable unless the old rites could be adapted and renewed. As the night deepened, Nell felt the weight of the forest's gaze upon her, its whispers both a warning and a call to arms. The battle ahead would test her sanity, courage, and the fragile bonds of folklore and reality she now dared to believe in. And somewhere, deep beneath the pines, the ancient darkness stirred anew, waiting for the next move. The small town's community center was packed beyond capacity, the air thick with a charged mixture of fear and frustration. Flickering fluorescent lights cast a cold, sterile glow over the gathered crowd, their murmurs swelling into a cacophony of whispered fears and veiled accusations. Nell stood in the back, notebook clutched tightly in her hands, her eyes scanning the restless faces, some familiar, some barely acquaintances, all marked by the strain of recent events. At the front, Sheriff Linda Caraway attempted to restore order, her voice firm but strained. "We need calm," she pleaded, but the room was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Voices rose in conflict. One man, his face flushed with anger, shouted, "It's those damn kids wandering into the woods. If the town just locked down the forest, none of this would happen." "That's not it," another woman snapped back. "It's something older, something evil. You can't just blame kids for disappearing." The tension rippled through the crowd, splintering it into factions. Some clung to rational explanations, desperate to believe in natural causes. Others whispered of curses, myths, and the dreaded Jersey Devil. Nell felt the weight of their fear like a tangible force pressing against her chest. Deputy Marcus Flynn caught her eye from the side of the room, his weathered expression grim but steady. After the meeting dissolved into heated arguments, Nell found him outside the sheriff's office, the grey sky low and heavy above them. Rain began to fall, a steady, soft percussion on the roof, as if the forest itself was listening. "This town's breaking apart," Marcus muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "People are scared, and scared folks do stupid things." Nell nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. "We have to find a way to bring them together. If that thing out there is real, we're all going to need each other." Marcus sighed, glancing down the empty street. "I want to believe, Nell, but I've seen too much not to be skeptical. Still, what you're saying, it's starting to make sense." Their uneasy alliance was fragile, but it was a start. Later that evening, Nell made her way to Mabel Crane's cabin, the path swallowed by creeping darkness and thickening fog. The herbalist's home smelled of dried herbs and earth, the flickering flames of a crackling fireplace casting dancing shadows across walls lined with jars and faded photographs. Mabel's piercing eyes met Nell's as she settled into a worn rocking chair. "The forest remembers," she said softly, voice gravelly but resolute. "It holds secrets older than any tale you've heard. This darkness beneath the pines, it's not just a legend. It's a shadow of something primordial." She leaned forward, the scent of sage and pine heavy in the air. "There was a pact once, made by those who came before us, to bind that shadow deep beneath the ground. But the bond weakens as the forest is disturbed." Nell listened, the pieces of the puzzle grinding together in her mind, the weight of ancient dread settling deeper. The next day, walking alone through the dense underbrush as dusk bled through the trees, Nell felt the forest's breath close around her. The whisper of leaves in the wind sounded almost like voices' warnings carried on the breeze. Shadows lengthened and shifted, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. Every step felt heavier, the isolation gnawing at her resolve. She stopped, heart pounding, eyes straining to pierce the gathering darkness. Was it the forest playing tricks, or was something watching? The boundary between myth and reality thinned with every passing moment. Back in town, the fractures among the townsfolk deepened. Rumors flourished. Blame was cast recklessly. Some barricaded themselves indoors. Others armed themselves with old charms and desperate prayers. The once tight-knit community splintered under the crushing weight of fear. Nell's attempts to unite them were met with suspicion or outright hostility. The isolation was no longer just physical, it was a growing chasm between neighbors, fueled by dread and mistrust. Yet, amidst the turmoil, Nell's determination hardened. If the primordial shade was truly awakening beneath the pines, if the ancient darkness was stirring once more, then unity was their only chance. If only she could convince a town unraveling at the seams. As night fell, the forest seemed to lean closer, its whispers louder and more insistent. Nell felt eyes in the shadows, cold and burning, watching, waiting. The fight was no longer just for truth, but for survival. And the forest would not relinquish its secrets easily. The fragile bonds of trust had shattered, and with them, the safety of the town. But the darkness was still coming, and Nell would face it alone if she must. The whispered voices of the pines never ceased, and neither did the creeping dread that clung to every leaf and shadow, promising that the nightmare was far from over. With a steadying breath, Nell stepped deeper into the night, bracing for the horrors still to come. The forest above seemed to hold its breath as Nell Hayes stood at the edge of a narrow fissure barely visible beneath the twisted roots of an ancient pine. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a rapid drum against the heavy silence that pressed down on the clearing. Marcus Flynn crouched beside her, his worn leather jacket catching stray shafts of pale afternoon light, his weathered face drawn tight with concern and determination. "You sure this is it?" Marcus's voice was low, rough with years of skepticism tempered by reluctant belief. "Looks more like a crack in the earth than some damn portal to hell." Nell swallowed hard, brushing damp moss aside to reveal a jagged opening descending into the earth. The air that rose from the fissure was cold and smelled of wet stone and something older, something rotted and alive. This is where Mabel's clues led us. The signs, the carvings, the old stories, they all pointed here. She pulled a flashlight from her pack and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the shadows to reveal a steep, rocky passage curling downward. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly from below, a steady, rhythmic tapping that seemed to pulse in time with Nell's quickening heartbeat. "Well, hell," Marcus muttered, standing and dusting off his pants. "If we're going down, we do it fast." Nell nodded, determination hardening her features. "Let's find out what's really beneath the pines." The descent was treacherous. Roots tangled like serpents along the walls, and slick stones threatened to send them tumbling into the abyss. Mabel followed, her thin frame surprisingly nimble despite her age, carrying a bundle of dried herbs that filled the air with a sharp, almost medicinal scent. As they reached the cavern floor, the flashlight revealed walls etched with cryptic carvings, ancient symbols that twisted and coiled like living things, telling stories long forgotten by time. Nell knelt to trace a line of the carvings with a trembling finger, feeling an inexplicable chill spread through her. "These markings," Mabel whispered, her voice reverent, "are the bindings. They kept the shade dormant, sealed beneath the earth by our ancestors." Suddenly, the cavern seemed to breathe. The shadows deepened and shifted, coalescing into shapes that defied logic, forms that flickered in and out of existence like smoke caught in a gust of wind. A low hum began to fill the space, vibrating in Nell's bones, and threatening to shatter her fragile composure. "It's here," she breathed, backing away slowly. The primordial shade, from the depths of the darkness to burning coals flared into existence, eyes that glowed with a malevolent fire, watching, waiting. The amorphous shape surrounding them writhed, indistinct, yet terrifyingly alive. Mabel stepped forward, chanting softly in an ancient dialect, the herbs in her hands igniting in a flare of golden light that illuminated the cavern's oppressive gloom. The flickering flames cast monstrous shadows that danced along the walls, revealing the full horror of the shade's four-man, ever-shifting mass of darkness that seemed to consume the very light around it. Marcus raised his flashlight, the beam slicing through the blackness, but the light seemed to falter against the entity's unnatural presence. "We need to hold it back," he said, voice shaking but resolute. Nell felt a wave of vertigo as the pulsing darkness pressed against her mind, whispering in a language older than human memory. Visions flashed before her eyes: twisted trees, bleeding shadows, endless nights filled with nameless terrors, and her brother Tommy lost in the void. "Focus," Mabel urged, her voice a lifeline. "The rites, Nell. You must remember." Summoning every ounce of strength, Nell reached into her memory, piecing together fragments of old stories, of whispered warnings, and of the ancient pact that had once bound the shade. The caverns seemed to contract, the darkness growing heavier, but the light from Mabel's herbs flickered stronger. "It feeds on fear," Nell realized aloud. "If we stand firm, we weaken it." The battle for the pines was no longer a distant legend whispered among scared townsfolk. It was here, beneath the roots and stones, a living nightmare clawing at the edges of their reality. As the cavern pulsed with malevolent life, Nell knew this was only the beginning. The ancient evil had been awakened, and the forest's shadows were watching, waiting for her next move. Her breath caught in her throat as the darkness shifted once more, and the eyes like coals burned brighter, promising that the whispers in the pines would never truly end.